him. You know, the Jews were eating certain foods, not eating certain foods, observing certain holidays, not observing other days. The Gentiles weren't doing that. The Gentiles weren't Jews. The Jews were still keeping their customs. And some of the Gentiles were worried that the Jews, they might not be as mature a Christian, as deep spiritual a Christian as the Jews were, because they weren't doing the same things the Jews were. That's where the quarrel came in. These were not Judaizers, the Jews. The Judaizers were going around saying, well, you must be circumcised, you must do this, you must become a Jew to be saved. That's what the letter to the Galatians is all about. Paul's refuting that heresy. These are not Judaizers that Paul is talking about, referring to, that are proclaiming the gospel for wrong motives. In fact, in the 3rd chapter of Philippians, Paul tells them to beware of the circumcision. Beware of those who mutilate the flesh. Now, who he's referring to, and he slurs the word circumcision, are the Judaizers. Paul is telling them in the 3rd chapter, beware of the Judaizers. He's not rejoicing in the Judaizers. I believe that the people that were preaching Christ from a wrong motive were true Christians. You know, we do the same thing today, don't we? Don't we argue over things? Some people believe in infant baptism. Others believe in believer's baptism. Christians disagree over the nature and the frequency of the Lord's Supper, right? And don't even get me started on Calvinism and Arminianism. Christians quarrel over issues, just like they did back then. And I believe that those people who are preaching, they are preaching the true gospel, but they're doing it out of the wrong motives. Nobody likes to be told that they're wrong. Nobody. You know, Christians shouldn't live that way, but we do. When we're arguing with somebody over baptism, over Calvinism versus Arminianism, you know, sometimes we get that ill feeling, right? Just like they did. We shouldn't, but we do. And I believe that those are the people that are preaching from a wrong motive. They are true Christians. They are preaching the true gospel. But they're doing it from wrong motives, trying to afflict Paul. What is Paul's response? He rejoices. You know, that's the way we need to live our lives. Paul understands that Christ is everything to him. He is living the future life in the present. You know, you might ask yourself, okay, I agree, Pastor, that Paul did live a totally consistent, holy life with total abandon. But that's Paul. That's not me. How can I do that? Well, let me answer that by stating a few things. First, Paul appropriated the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Christ very personally into his life. We need to do the same thing. If you would turn to Galatians chapter 2, please, verse 20 through 22, I want to read that. Paul personally appropriated in a very personal way the death of Christ to his life. That's the first thing we need to do if we want to live the future life in the present. Let me read Galatians 2:20 through 22. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God. For if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died of no purpose. You notice when you read those verses how many times Paul says, I and me. Christ died for me. I was crucified with Christ. You know, that's the first time that I've ever heard of the iitis disease being a good thing. Paul is making it very personal. Me, I. That's the first thing we need to do. And that, brings me to my second point. If we want to live the future life in the present, we must always remember that God is sovereign. We're talking about a being who's in a class all by himself. We're talking about a transcendent being. Now, he's immanent, but we need to remember that God is sovereign. We're trying to know the unknowable. And that's going to be the title of my sermon for next week, by the way. Knowing the unknowable, Lord willing. But how can the finite man understand and learn from and of an infinite God? How is that possible? Well, first thing I want to bring up about that is we need to know some things about our faith. Propositional truth, objective truth. If you look at Matthew chapter 16, remember that wonderful confession that Peter made when Jesus Christ asked him, "Whom do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now that's propositional truth. That is objective truth. We need that. That's necessary, but we need more than that. We also need experiential truth, subjective truth as well. We need to encounter the deity in a very personal way. The very next instant that you read in Matthew, after that declaration, after that confession of Peter, is the transfiguration of the Lord Jesus Christ on the Mount. Remember that? 17th chapter, right after that confession. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John with him up to the top of the mount. And he's transfigured before them. Their response, Peter's response, he falls flat on the ground. He's encountering the sacred deity at that moment. We also need that. We need to encounter God in a very personal way. God is a relational being. He's made us in the image of his image to have a relationship with him. The Lord wants that relationship. We need both. We need propositional truth